Desai'nin's presentation on capitalism, coronavirus and war, geopolitical economy approach. This is part of the Cappadocia University seminar series. We welcome as part of this series the speeches by top speakers from different countries. And today we are honored to host Professor Radhika Desai'nin. I would like to introduce her work. She doesn't need introduction, but I should first briefly introduce her publications to you. Professor Radhika Desai is professor at Department of Political Studies and also director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the University of Manitoba in Canada. She is also convener of International Manifesto Group. She proposed a historical materialist approach to understanding world affairs in her geopolitical economy, in her book entitled as Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, which was published in 2013. She has published a dozen books, over 100 articles and book chapters on UK, Indian, US, and European politics, as well as international affairs. Today, she is going to talk about her latest book, published by Routledge Press. This book is entitled as Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, a Geopolitical Economy. This book is published as part of series on rethinking globalization, and the book is available because it is open access book published by Routledge, as I said, very prestigious publisher. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Radhika Desai. After her presentation, we will have Q&A session. Until then, floor is yours, Professor Desai.
Thank you so much, Professor Tanrısever. I would first like to say that it's a great honor for me to give this talk about my newest book at the Cappadocia University seminar series, and I'd particularly like to thank you for moderating it and Shafak Oyuz for initiating all this. So, and of course, also thanks to everyone in the audience for their interest. So, I'd like to speak for about 20 minutes, and in this brief time, I would like to say a few words about how I came to write this book, and then run through some of the main arguments that I make in it. Obviously, it's not possible to discuss everything, but I'll try to give you a flavor of what I've done. So from the start of the pandemic, my perspective on it was very distinctive. I was not so much concerned about the public health, about the virus and its biological origins or whatever. My principal concern was the following question. Why had what should have been merely a public health emergency, although a very serious one, turned into a knockdown crisis of capitalism, leading to financial markets of every type falling like stones, central banks engaging in the most unprecedented rescue operations, and economies facing stoppages and blockages as never before. In the middle of March 2020, just after the World Health Organization declared the crisis a pandemic, I wrote a column for the Canadian left magazine Canadian Dimension reflecting this preoccupation, and that article was entitled Capitalism, Coronavirus and Capitalism, the Unexpected Reckoning. Now, the critique of capitalism on which that article was based was something I had been developing, a critique of capitalism at the world level for several decades. And already then, in mid-March 2020, I could see that the pandemic was, as we say in English, telling on capitalism. And this expression, telling on capitalism, means two quite different things, and both were true in the case. So on the one hand, to tell on somebody or something means to reveal their dirty secrets, and the pandemic was revealing the dirty secrets of capitalism, its inequality, its productive debility, its misogyny and racism, the whole shebang. And at the same time, the pandemic was putting unbearable stresses on it, weakening it further. So and in this column that I wrote, I was building on my work on geopolitical economy, in particular my 2013 book, which Professor Tanrısever has already mentioned, Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. And the purpose of this book was to essentially sort of clear the ground for a fresh perspective or fresh approach to international relations, because I did not agree with the established approaches and lenses through which we have become habituated over the last many decades of looking at world affairs. And I mean by that paradigms of free trade, US hegemony, globalization, etc. So in geopolitical economy, I made three arguments. First of all, I argued that thanks to the contradictions of capitalism, states have always been centrally involved in managing capitalisms. So that's a very, very fundamental thing. You have to put it out there, because unfortunately, far too much of these dominant approaches, of which, by the way, critical approaches like Marxism are also a part, because basically most Marxists accept one or the other of these approaches. So I go directly against that, and I say that you have to have a genuine political and geopolitical economy of capitalism, not an economics, which unfortunately too many people do. Secondly, I argue that as a result of this fact, which is that states are central to managing capitalism's contradictions, on the international plane, relations between what Marx called producing nations, international relations, were governed by the logic of imperialism, because essentially imperialism stems directly from the contradictions of capitalism, and these contradictions make capitalism expansionist. And then, so on the one hand, there is the imperialism, and on the other hand, inevitably, because there is imperialism, those countries that are willing and able to resist imperialism resist it. So the resistance to imperialism forms the other side of the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism, or what Trotsky dubbed the dialectic of uneven and combined development. So this fact has meant that the historical evolution of the capitalist world cannot be adequately described by notions like globalization, which envisage merely spreading markets and spreading capitalism, nor can it be described in terms of the idea of successive hegemonies culminating in US hegemony. Indeed, in geopolitical economy, one of my main arguments is that there is no such thing as US hegemony. So you cannot understand the world order in under any of these rubrics, but you must understand it rather as the unfolding of the dialectic of imperialism and anti-imperialism, in which the logic of anti-imperialism has prevailed with great difficulty against great odds, with a lot of effort and suffering and death and killing and so on, but nevertheless it has prevailed, leading to ever widening multipolarity, or what, following Hugo Chavez, after I published my 2013 book, I have also been calling pluripolarity. So Hugo Chavez said that multipolarity is not very accurate because it fails to register that these different poles of productive power around the world often feature very, very different economic systems, something we should know, because of course the bipolar world was made of capitalist countries on the one hand and an attempt to create socialism on the other. So anyway, that was the second argument. And the third argument that geopolitical economy made is that globalization and US hegemony and free trade, all these dominant approaches, which posed as theories for understanding the modern world, were not theories at all. They were ideologies that served the interests of dominant countries by portraying the world economy as a single seamless whole, which in fact it was, and if it was not, it should be. The purpose of this ideology was to pry open the economies of the rest of the world outside the core capitalist economies so that they may serve to help imperialist countries deal with their contradictions, whether as outlets for excess commodities or excess capital, or as sources for cheap and cheapened labor and raw materials. So the book I published, and by the way, also now in our age, increasingly cheaper manufactured goods. My book was published in 2013, and since then, if anything, capitalism's decline and the further advance of multipolarity have become even more clearer. And particularly, this is so in the case, in terms of capitalism's decline, the decline is most manifest in the case of the neoliberal financialized heartland of capitalism, which is composed of the United States and, of course, the United Kingdom. So, in Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, the book I'm talking about today, which, by the way, I should say has been downloaded over 10,000 times. And I encourage you all to please obtain your copy because it's free. And even if you read parts of it, I think you will gain a lot of what I want to say. So it was originally going to extend this analysis to capitalism in the pandemic, but I was late in submitting the manuscript. And by early 2022, we also had the launch of what I take to be the proxy war against Russia, led by the United States. And it was very clear to me that this war involved the same problems and the same characteristics of a declining capitalism that I had been commenting on in the context of the pandemic. And so the war and the circumstances in which it had erupted and how it was evolving up to the point when I sent my book to press had also to be brought into the analysis. So what started as capitalism, coronavirus and capitalism became capitalism, coronavirus and war. Now, what does this book argue? So, first of all, it argues that the current NATO war on Russia is the result of a decaying neoliberal financialized capitalism, which is also increasingly losing its imperial hold on the rest of the world, and led and under US leadership is sort of cadaverously trying to get it back. So it's practically dead, but this practically dead entity is still trying to hold on to power. So that gives a certain macabre character to what's going on right now. Secondly, the war's counterproductive results, the unraveling of US influence in various parts of the world, the unraveling of dollar dominance, these and many other such phenomena further underline capitalism's and imperialism's rapidly dwindling options. Thirdly, as the geopolitical economy approach has long argued, while actually existing socialism was always the leading edge of opposition to capitalism, today more and more countries, no matter the political character of their governments, are no longer either willing or able to subordinate themselves to imperialism, which is why you have manifested more instances of countries refusing the leadership of the United States and the West more generally. Further, the pandemic told on capitalism in both senses of the expression. As I've already said, it exposed contemporary capitalism's dirty secrets, its inequality, productive debility, racism, misogyny, and exacerbated its already mounting difficulties. And that's why we have such a knockdown crisis which pervades society, finance, culture, economy, and politics. As the US and the UK especially showed, I argue further, neoliberal financialized capitalism, which I also argue is the only form capitalism can take today if it is to avoid the danger of socialism, has performed disastrously in the pandemic. And by contrast, the socialist countries led by China have performed spectacularly well. Further, after 4 decades of determinedly neoliberal policies, which were supposed to revive capitalism, this outcome shows that capitalism is past its new use-by date. Neoliberalism has not revived capitalism, it had only weakened it further. And indeed, that this use-by date had been sort of passed decades ago, possibly even a century ago, when capitalism entered the monopoly phase. And if this is so, then this would actually be in line with Marx's arguments, because Marx had argued, so that would be in line with what Marx had predicted. Now, this monopoly phase, thanks to the dialectic of uneven and combined development, developed most fully in the late 19th century challengers to British dominance, such as Germany and the United States, much as Hilferding and Bukharin, for example, had been saying at that time. Britain's dominance had been founded on capitalism's competitive phase. The monopoly phase represented the culmination of capitalism's ability to develop the forces of production. Brutally and chaotically, though it had done so up to that point. They would now be developed only through planning, whether that planning took place in giant monopoly corporations or in the context of interventionist or socialist states. However, capitalism continued to exist in good part because early in its history, the Western left had squandered its potential role in preventing this by turning away from Marx and adopting what I've discussed in many of my publications, adopting what Bukharin calls a policy of theoretical reconciliation with the theoretical and political antithesis of Marxism, which is neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics was born in the 1870s, and more or less from that point on, many Marxists began adopting this and theoretically reconciling attitude, and as a consequence, they lost touch with Marx. And this is a large part of my understanding of why the left finds itself in such a bad situation today, why it is not able to take leadership of a large anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist movement as it should do, because time is now ripe for it to do so. So this theoretical turn blinded the left to the reality of imperialism, rendering them incapable of understanding the main dynamic of the international relations of the capitalist world. It's what I call its geopolitical economy. They then became directly implicated, in turn, towards a guns and butter reformism, in which basically the left accepts the imperialism of the first world countries while gaining a few reforms in return. So in this led inexorably, of course, to European social democracy's shocking complicity with the outbreak of the First World War. Within a decade of the publication of Capital Volume 1, within a decade of publication of some of the greatest works on Marxism, I'm talking about the classical theories of imperialism of the early 21st century. Thanks to the policy of theoretical reconciliation with neoclassical economics, Western economics had performed this act of intellectual self-mutilation and become unable to understand the realities of imperialism. With this, Western Marxism, on the one hand, rejected Marx's analysis of capitalism as contradictory value production on the spurious grounds that this analysis suffered from a transformation problem, that Marx did not believe that capitalism suffered from chronic demand deficits, and that he was wrong to believe that there was a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. On the other hand, Western Marxists lionized capitalism. It was now, in their view, shorn of its contradictions, including the memento mori, or reminder of death, that is the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Instead of seeing capitalism as plagued with these problems, Western Marxists tended to see it as prodigiously productive, incessantly able to develop the forces of production. This is not a Marxist interpretation, it's a Schumpeterian interpretation. And this weakened Western Marx's ability to understand what actually existing socialism had achieved. So this is where we come to how what you think of capitalism also affects what you think of actually existing socialism, because Western Marxists failed to appreciate what they had achieved by building considerable prosperity without the privilege of imperialism, and indeed in the teeth of imperialism. So in that sense, there's a huge problem in understanding what's going on around the world. Was a comprehensive crisis of both capitalism and the imperial world that it had created. Therefore, not only did 1914 constitute the peak of imperialism, after which it has been declining, not as fast as most of us would like, but nevertheless declining, but it was also the peak of capitalism. That is why eminent thinkers like Keynes and Polanyi progressive thinkers like them, believed that the close of the crisis period, the end of the Second World War, would find the world turning towards some kind of socialism, not full-fledged socialism, but some kind of socialism, and certainly away from capitalism. And the same diagnosis led the opponents of socialism, like Friedrich Hayek, to fear the same development and to try to do what he could to forestall it, beginning with the writing of The Road to Serfdom. These hopes and fears were not dispelled by the Golden Age. You know, the fact that we had the Golden Age after the Second World War is taken by many to feel that to mean that these fears and hopes were misplaced, but actually they were not. The Golden Age did see communism establish itself from Prague to Pyongyang, subtracting vast swathes of the world from capitalism completely. It saw the developing world embarking on national autonomous development projects that took distinctively socialist forms. And finally, the homelands of capitalism, for their part, witnessed the greatest surge in their growth, thanks not to any capitalist dynamism, but entirely because their senile monopoly capitalisms were ringed around with socialistic structures, including macroeconomic management for full employment, progressive taxation, substantial state ownership, financial repression, including capital controls, industrial regulation, recognition and enlargement of substantial workers' rights and strong unions, and not least a more or less elaborate welfare state. So, inevitably, having abandoned Marx, Western Marxists misattributed this growth of the Golden Age to capitalism's own productive dynamism. And this was a radical misdiagnosis. Notwithstanding the socialistic constraints within which first world capitalism now operated, the underlying character of the capitalist character of first world economies landed them in deep crisis by the 1970s. In response, their political leaders chose to roll back rather than deepen the post-war socialistic measures, falsely claiming that these measures were responsible for the crisis rather than for the growth that had preceded it. These leaders thus concluded that rolling them back would release capitalism's animal spirits and its productive dynamism and turbocharge the productive revival of the capitalist world. Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War explains why this neoliberal turn failed. Capitalism's inability to generate growth, let alone the sort of broad-based prosperity that was possible in the post-war world, became ever clearer with every passing decade of neoliberalism. Rather than productive dynamism, capitalism could only generate unproductive, predatory, and speculative financialization, a deadly combination of rising indebtedness and asset bubbles that strangulate production and increases in inequality, as well as a routine financial crises. This type of capitalism sported not the advanced financial systems that originally developed in the countries of finance capital. You know, many people think that today's financialization is explained by what Hilferding was talking about back in the early 20th century. No, Hilferding was talking about the opposite type of financial system. So he was talking about a productive financial system, but what we saw now is, as I say, archaic, speculative, and predatory, which is a complete opposite. At that time, Hilferding pointed out that this archaic system existed in the UK, whereas in Germany, etc., there was a better financial system. And what we've seen is the spread of the UK-style system, first to the US and then also elsewhere. The resulting neoliberal financialized capitalism is the only sort of capitalism now possible. It cannot survive without crises. Both the sort to which it is prone, such as its own imminent crises, whether of demand or profits, falling profits, etc., as well as public health crisis or climate crisis, which are also endogenous, in my humble opinion, to capitalism. So it cannot survive without these crises, but nor will it survive without the crises that it must now foment, such as the ongoing war, in order to keep going. Because like fascism, it lacks its own stability and can only continue in existence amid the bubbling froth and confusion of crises. So, ever since we turned back from the socialistic path of the post-Second World War era, we have been paying the price. Humanity as a whole has been paying the price economically, socially, culturally, politically, and internationally of keeping capitalism alive. This cost today includes a political system that yo-yos between neoliberalism, which includes apparently leftist solutions to the crisis, such as universal basic income, modern monetary theory, etc., all of which are nowhere close to what we need to be thinking about, and forces even further to the right, whose rise is in good part a direct result of the left's inability to understand capitalism, imperialism, and therefore the realities of actually existing socialism, which has always been the cutting edge of the battle against imperialism. And so finally, the struggle against imperialism is therefore the most important task if we are to stop paying this price, because imperialism keeps capitalism going in its homelands and prevents the transition to socialism outside them. So I hope this has given you some idea of the structure of my argument. There's much else I could talk about, and perhaps we'll talk about it in the question and answer period, but I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Desai, for this very clear and very to the point discussion of your main points. I think you clarified your position very clearly. And then now, I think before moving to the discussion, I would like to go through the book for the audience in terms of the structure and review the book very briefly. As you nicely outlined the argument, this argument is explained very well in the book. First, in the introductory part, you define concepts and establish linkages between core concepts of your book, the financialized capitalism, neoliberal financialized capitalism, pandemic, and war, and how they are closely related. You consider capitalism as a defining concept, and the war and pandemic simply deepen the contradictions of capitalism and accelerate these processes. So we should pay more attention to, in order to understand issues of war and pandemic, we should pay attention to the inherent crisis of capitalism. So it is an organizing concept, and you define capitalism as contradictory value production. So you differ from liberal economists in your conceptualization of capitalism as you formulate your approach in Marxist tradition. Of course, you differentiate your position in that tradition, but unlike liberal, uh, neoliberal Marxists, neoliberal economists, you conceptualize the economic and social and economic character of capitalism in this well-known Marxist tradition. But you also introduce a geopolitical approach, which is quite unique. I would like to discuss that in the discussion part, because geopolitics, I mean, Marxists usually focus on political economy, but they see geopolitics as a different field of study, and they don't really pay attention to this aspect. And the originality of your work, to me, lies also in bringing this geopolitical approach closer to political economy approach, and you focus mainly on the financialization process in neoliberal economy and its problems. And finally, we need to consider the nature of capitalism and alternatives to capitalism, how to deal with the inherent problems of capitalism, you don't consider solutions produced within system. You propose more radical or non-systemic solution to the problems of capitalism, and you really invite the audience and the broader academic and non-academic world to think about these fundamental issues. So it is a really very comprehensive approach to major issues affecting different communities in different parts of the world. Definitely, your work needs to be read widely. Maybe this is a good idea for Rootlet instead of making. Making this book open access is a good idea because anyone could have access and they could benefit and be part of that discussion. As an academic specializing in area studies, studying security issues in regional and international, transnational contexts, of course, your literature, the literature that you discuss in this book, in your book, is a bit different from my specialization, but I am familiar with your literature. So I think there will be good dialogue between these different fields of specialization, and then maybe my question, you could when you answer my questions, then I could understand some of the issues, and also our audience will contextualize your ideas better in their own specialized areas of knowledge. I think the main problem for today's academy is this division of labor and the specialization, and your work is quite valuable in inviting us to pay more attention to the total discourses. Unfortunately, for maybe after 1990s, we don't read such books that focus on these systemic issues. Instead of focusing on the system, we focus on the parts, whether it is maybe even economists, they focus on the smaller parts of the economic relations, so they don't study a systemic approach. But in addition to bringing our attention to systemic processes, you also combine this geopolitical approach with the political economy approach, which is quite interesting because for a very long period of time in geopolitical studies, geopolitics is also considered to be quite outdated and irrelevant. You could also see that kind of approach towards political economy field. Of course, there is increasing interest in political economy, but this Marxist tradition has been discredited after the collapse of Soviet Union, and studies in that literature is not also discussed as widely as before. In the 20th century, there were more discussion about these concepts, issues than 21st century. But you also combine these approaches and bring new light to this broader issue. Of course, capitalism lies at the center of sociological studies, political economic studies. As an IR academic, we have been discussing this approach from mainly Wallerstein's perspective, American sociologist and international relations expert Immanuel Wallerstein developed world systems perspective, and he really studied the function of world capitalist system, and he used this Brodel's perspective in sociology, and used the Marxist class analysis and applied that to interstate relations. He also called for socialist world system. Of course, his approach was quite interesting, but there was also alternatives to this kind of Marxist analysis in international relations. One of them was Gramscian approach, developed by Robert Cox, and his, of course, you don't agree with the hegemony approach, and you don't think that it is relevant for understanding the function of capitalist system. But he also popularized this Gramscian notion of hegemony and how classes are connected internationally, and the need for cooperation among classes at the global level. We have also another critical approach from Frankfurt School tradition. That approach was popularized by Andrew Linklater, the British thinker. He thought that it is important to reflect on our practice of international relations from critical perspective, and emphasized importance of emancipatory action. But all these approaches have some strengths, and it attracted attention of the academy. But at the end of the day, constructivist studies prevailed in the literature over these Marxist approaches, as the leader of this critical line of thinking. By critical, I mean non-liberal, non-political realist. So political realism emphasized geopolitics, liberalism emphasized economy, but not political economy. So your approach is quite original in bringing these three traditions, Marxism, liberalism, and realism together, not from a constructivist perspective, but from your own original perspective. I think the advantage of having that kind of approach is that it enables us to see the system totality. But the problem may lie in the specifics, because how to apply this total perspective to specific issues, because problems of capitalism may differ from, let's say, the problems in Canada and problems in Turkey, problems in India, problems in Greece, problems in Germany, Brazil, so on. More and more people think that it is important to focus on these individual cases at the risk of ignoring the totality. So both approaches have strengths and weaknesses, I think. But it is always good to listen to systemic discussions about what's happening around the world. In that, I genuinely benefited from reading your work, and it is really uh, requires us to ask new questions and maybe search for answers, even if we don't know the answers. But we should really keep asking questions. In that, this total approaches, systemic approaches, I believe, are very useful. So I wonder, um, how do you see these discussions about geopolitics and political economy? Because in European academia, if you study political economy, you ignore geopolitics. If you study geopolitics, you ignore political economy. So they don't really talk so much about their studies among themselves. But your approach brings them together. Maybe you talk to both traditions. Um, what do you think? What are the advantages of studying these topics together?
Sure. Shall I reply now?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you for what I take to be a really, I think, very accurate a summary or outline of what I'm trying to do. And then some really interesting points on which you have focused, which I think are actually very central. They go to the core of the argument. So, if I may just respond in the order in which you raise those points, I think coming to your final question last, that would be really good. So, first of all, you I think you're very acute in focusing on what I criticize as the social scientific division of labor, because, and you rightly said that, what has happened particularly since the 1990s has been that we have all sort of gone off into our specialized silos, and we have been focusing on that and not looking at the larger picture, the total picture, as you rightly say. And I've actually pointed this out in a number of my writings as well. So in this point comes into the current book, after having had a sort of long life elsewhere. So what I've found in my own study of Marxism and my own understanding of the encounter between Marxism and bourgeois modes of thinking is something like the following. Essentially, if you think about classical political economy, whose culmination was Marxism, what you find is that they were not social scientists. They did not divide up the study of society into discrete little bits. What's more, they were also historical thinkers, so that, for them, there were determinate agents so political economy was a historical science in which determinate agents, particularly classes, states, etc., acted in certain ways. They were constituted historically in certain ways. They acted in certain ways, and so on. And this was, and at the end of the day, what was classical political economy up to and including Marx? It was a way of trying to understand the new type of society, namely capitalism, that was emerging. It displayed very new dynamics, so people were sort of scratching their heads saying, what is this? And that's how we would understand the best of classical political economy. So it was historical, and it was also totalistic. That is to say, it took the whole thing into account. So this continues into Marx. Marx is writing a critique of political economy, but he doesn't reject everything. He just resolves their problems, their mistakes, their antinomies, their confusions. And in doing so, he produces the most radical, powerful indictment of capitalism it was possible to have. Then along comes neoclassical economics. Partly, I think it comes along chiefly because, by looking at capitalism the way it did, even classical political economy before Marx, let alone after Marx, had been too radical. So, for example, Smith and Ricardo both thought that only labor produces value. Well, if only labor produces value, there is no justification for profits. You already had currents of Ricardian socialism that existed even before Marx comes along. And then once Marx and Engels have done their work, I mean, it's impossible to justify capitalism in terms of classical political economy. So a new approach is needed, and a new approach arrives. It arrives in the form of neoclassical economics, whose methodology, not only whose ideas, but whose very methodology is completely alien. For example, it has no conception of value. There's something called utility, but that's completely different and superficial, etc. So what I say is that what happened around this time is that bourgeois ways of studying society, which was essentially colored by this intervention, because the moment neoclassical economics arrives, neoclassical economics says there is something called the economy, and it is completely separate from society. And then Max Weber comes along and sanctifies this distinction, says, modern societies are just like that. They develop in ways, they create autonomous spheres of action, and those autonomous spheres of action require autonomous disciplines to study them. So you have economic sociology, then political science, and what have you. And so you get this division of labor, which has been very destructive. Everybody recognizes that it's been destructive partially because everybody says, oh, we should do interdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity and all that. But everybody even then forgets that what was really lost was a historical way of thinking. And that historical way of thinking of Marx and Engels is what I'm trying to go back to. So that's my first point. Secondly, therefore, as a consequence, I see the label geopolitical economy not as bringing geopolitics in. I think geopolitics and all of those traditions really belong to the same problematic way of understanding society, which came along with neoclassical economics and what I call the social scientific division of labor, because they separate geopolitics from geoeconomics and what have you. What I'm refusing is this separation. I want to go back to a way of understanding capitalism as a whole, and therefore so it's political economy and then geopolitical economy to understand what happens at the level of the relations between these separate societies, which I think are meaningfully separate. I don't buy the view that there are no national economies and so on. Then you also mentioned a number of different ways of understanding the world. And so first of all, I should say, you mentioned, for example, world systems approach, Wallerstein, of course, Arrighi. And I have to say, I have learned an enormous amount from these people. They are exceedingly erudite writers. Everybody should read their books. But I do think they made a big mistake by endorsing this idea of successive hegemonies. What I show in my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy, is that this idea that British hegemony has declined, now we will have US hegemony, was a discourse that emerged from American policymaking circles. And then this discourse would have remained what it was, a sort of a discourse coming from the apparatus of the state, had not various scholars given it a dignity it would not have otherwise had. And the biggest contribution to the dignity of this approach was made by the erudition of the Wallersteins, the Arrighis of this world, who applied this method. So I feel that they gave us a very rich understanding of the world economy, but I think on their theoretical points, they were not right, and I have a critique of them in my Geopolitical Economy. And I also don't generally agree that yes, there are attempts to try to create transnational classes, but the fact of the matter is that national economies still remain very real. I mean, look at the whole project of the EU. If national economies were irrelevant, the EU would not have such great difficulty coming up with a European level of integration. The fact of the matter is that the structures of the EU still remain determined by the small nation states that still exist, and overall, their interests are not easily harmonized with those of the United States, a process which we are seeing whose mounting contradictions we are witnessing in the context of the current war. So again, I don't necessarily accept that. And you also asked the question, how do you apply the geopolitical economy approach, which is so totalistic and so on, to specific countries and their specific problems, say Turkey or Brazil or what have you? And I think there's an answer to that, which is that what geopolitical economy makes you conscious of is that the world economy is composed of national economies, which are, however, hierarchically structured in relation to one another. Some are more powerful than others, but this hierarchical structuring is in the process of being contested. Now, once you have this overall view and you place countries, say like Turkey or Brazil or whichever country you are concerned with, you place them in that context, then what this alerts you to is that you shouldn't understand Turkey in the context of US hegemony or globalization. You should understand Turkey in the context of this hierarchy of nations and the possibilities of contestation of this hierarchy. So to me, the specificity, of course, it has to be developed. In fact, before the pandemic, I was about to embark on a research project which would have included all the major countries of the world, the G7 plus the BRICS or the G20, depending on how much money we got. Anyway, the point is that we would have experts on each of these countries come together and talk about how they fit into such a larger geopolitical economy of capitalism and socialism, etc. And that would have been a very interesting enterprise, but the pandemic interrupted it. But it's still something that could and probably should be done. And then finally, you ask again about geopolitical economy and geopolitics and political economy. And so I just want to say that I don't think that approaches which separate politics from economics, as separate realms, they don't work. So to me, I'm not bringing in geopolitics into my work, although I do think that the people generally associated with these, like they're usually quite right-wing writers, such as I'm trying to think, Carl Schmitt, Spikeman, Alfred Mann, Brzezinski, and there's another name that's slipping my mind, Mackinder. These are the writers who are worth reading for what they were symptoms of, what they expressed. I think we should read them, but we should place them in a larger historical understanding of the political economy of their countries and of the world that they expressed. So that's what we should do. But overall, I'm basically taking political economy and I'm saying what would be the equivalent of political economy up to and including Marx at the international level. So one of the key things I've done, I'll say in closing, is that what I've done is, for me, geopolitical economy is a way of understanding world affairs which is truly Marxist. And this also goes against, unfortunately, what has happened to many Marxists, which is that they have either bought into globalization or they have bought into US hegemony, and we need to come back from there. We need to bring our comrades back from there and say this was not the way to look at it, obviously in dialogue and everything, but we need to say, especially now when I think that the imperialist system is in the throes of a very major crisis, and I think that we are once again, the Rosa Luxemburg question, socialism or barbarism, faces us is looking us in the eye, and our inability as a collective to understand imperialism is what really stands in the way of taking a progressive position that will lead humanity out of this mess and into somewhere in a hopeful direction.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to the wider audience, I would like to ask two further questions about other concepts. I mean, you clarified your view of capitalism and its current crisis, as well as your own geopolitical economy approach. I would like you to discuss a bit more about coronavirus. And first, because coronavirus was quite interesting and novel development. Of course, it was a tragic one, but in addition to slowing down the pace of global economy, it also reminded us importance of mankind and also our way of life and the role of healthcare system. And we realized that our healthcare system is not sufficient for meeting the needs of societies in all countries, whether developed or underdeveloped, because economically speaking, it was based on the assumption that only small percent of the population may require healthcare, but when they demand en masse, then the whole system experience crisis. This is partly about capitalism. It is partly about the way that we think about society or politics or economy, because we realize that human beings don't lie at the center. The elderly people suffered greatly. I mean, that was also the social justice problem, because the healthcare system focused on the other segments of population. So there were such choices, and they were all tragic. And but what we realized is that human beings don't seem to be at the center. So we assume that whole everything is at the service of mankind, but we realized that this was an illusion. But there was also another important experience. With this slowing down of global economy, we realized that the carbon emissions also declined. The environmental problems have declined in most of European countries. Pollution decreased as part of decrease in traffic and also industrial production. This was also this also reminded us the not so environment friendly nature of industrial production of our urban life. We learned a lot about our contradictions, our problems. Once the coronavirus is declared to be over, not so critical issue anymore. Now we don't see any emphasis on this. I think we also forgot about this. We don't see investment in this area, rethinking on healthcare issue, as if there won't be new pandemics. What do you think about this? Why we don't take lessons from our experiences, and how do you reflect on the tragedies of coronavirus?
That's such an important question. So, if I may say, maybe begin with the following observation that really I focus in my book on what I call the neoliberal financialized capitalisms, the most advanced neoliberal. So, which are basically the US and the UK. But I would say that most of our societies resemble them to a considerable degree. And it seems as though the ruling elites of these countries, they have only one commitment, one overriding commitment, and that is to keep in power, to preserve the power of big capitalist corporations, financial and non-financial. And so as a result, they have this only one overriding commitment. To assume that they are going to learn the lessons of how to do better for ordinary citizens is the wrong assumption. They are not going to. They're not going to unless we force them out of power and impose upon our governments different priorities. So that's my first point. Second point is that, the incidence of what are called zoonotic viruses, so AIDS, Zika, SARS, all these, they have jumped from animals to human beings. This has been happening systematically beginning with the neoliberal era emerging. I mean, the first such epidemic was AIDS. It was a zoonotic virus, and this is happening because even though neoliberal capitalism is not very productive, it has been extremely destructive of the environment, and particularly it has been destroying the habitats of wild animals. And the more we destroy and on the one hand, it has been destroying the habitats of wild animals. On the other hand, it has been farming animals in increasingly large numbers. So the potential for viruses to jump from wild animals to domesticated animals to human beings, we are creating the pathway for it. People have been warning about this for a while, but our governments, which are not interested in the well-being of the population, they are more interested in ensuring that the state functions to support big capital. They have not been listening. Indeed, as you may remember, when the pandemic first emerged, there were all these stories in the press about how many governments had not only not made preparations for such things which had been warned about. Remember, just in the previous years, we had Ebola, we had Zika, we had all these viruses threatening us, but we had made no preparation for it. And indeed, many of the preparations that had been made previously had been got rid of in the zeal to cut expenditures. So in this way, our governments failed us in the prevention part. And then I would say that they also failed us in dealing with the pandemic once it occurred. Because what I also discuss in my book is that certainly in the case of the US and the UK, both governments did contemplate simply allowing the virus to run through the population. Let it take whoever it wants. Whoever dies, dies. Whoever lives, lives. That's what we are going to do. We can't do anything about this. It's not. And just imagine what a murderous strategy that was. But that's what they were considering. And the only reason they decided not to go that way is because they were warned by their own advisors that if you go this way, then the level of economic disruption will be too great. And when we mean economic disruption, we mean for them, it is the disruption of the profit-making processes of big capital, not the disruption of your and my economy. So the rhetoric that is always used is, we have to worry about the economy, but what is the economy for them? It's the economy of the big corporations. So that's the second thing I think I'd like to emphasize. And thirdly, then therefore, when they realized that they couldn't just step back and do nothing, then what they decided to do in most of these countries is what was called flattening the curve. What did that mean? It meant that you are going to allow the pandemic to spread, allow a lot of infections, but you're going to keep them below the point at which they would overwhelm the hospital systems. And remember, these are hospital systems that have been weakened by 40 years of neoliberalism. 40 years worth of cuts. No talk of giving them more money beyond just the most specialized sort, to deal with the pandemic. No talk of expanding it, etc. And this is, so to me, this was so during the pandemic, and it, as you rightly say, remains so now. There is no talk of expanding the healthcare system to be more resilient. And by the way, it's not just a question of dealing with the patients once they get infected. It's also a question of how are you going to prevent the infections? How do you pursue what's called a maximum suppression, or what's sometimes called a zero COVID policy? How do you pursue a policy of zero infections? Because the fact of the matter is, you don't want to find out. If you can eliminate the virus with a minimum number of infections, that's the best strategy. And you can do that if you have a very different type of healthcare system than what we have right now. Our healthcare systems over the last 40 years have become very capital intensive. We have eliminated labor, and particularly skilled labor, from our healthcare systems, and this is what you will need. You would need community-based, trust-based networks where people are on the ground, they are monitoring what's happening in every neighborhood, they are isolating and supporting those who may be suspected of having a virus, but not in a way as to stigmatize them, not to subject them to loss of income, etc., but to give them the support they need. to remain isolated so that the rest of the community does not get infected, but they are still taken care of. All these things are possible, but these were not done because we no longer have those systems. And why do we not have them now? Why is there no discussion of this now? Because, as I emphasized throughout the book, there has been a massive failure of the left. And the massive failure of the left ultimately arises from a fear of actually existing socialism. Because essentially, the left in Western countries has had this idea that, capitalism is going to solve all the problems of production. All we have to worry about is distributing it. But and they look at actually existing socialism, whether in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe in the past or China today, and they say, oh no, that's terrible, we are not going to do that, and we don't need to do that. And this involves a complete failure of the understanding of imperialism. Number one, when you don't understand imperialism, you don't understand the extent to which the wealth of first world countries rests on imperialism and imperial extraction. If you don't understand that, you are going to misattribute the prosperity of first world countries to capitalism's own magic. And this is wrong. Then, secondly, you will not understand what has actually been achieved in the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe in the past, in China today, or other socialist countries, because you simply don't understand the extent to which imperialism was aided the development of first world countries, but at the same time was an obstacle to the development of these socialist countries. So they had to overcome those obstacles, and they had to overcome those obstacles while powerful imperialist countries were resisting them. So if you don't understand these things, you are simply going to say, well, you are simply going to be unable to contemplate what actual socialism will look like when it comes to your country. And so, for these reasons, the left has been engaged in a long process of failure. Basically, the failure of 1914 was followed by the failures of the post-war era, when practically all the Marxist parties of the advanced industrial countries accepted, reformism. Then further into the neoliberal period, neoliberalism should have been the time when the left was really on the march, because there was so much to oppose. But the left was missing in action. In fact, the historic parties of the working class were moved further to the right by the likes of Blair and Clinton and so on. So by the time we get to the 2010s and the 2020s, there is basically no left, which is why the only opposition you found in the Western countries to what the government was doing on the coronavirus. And there was a lot to oppose, but the only opposition you saw were from madcap anti-vaxxers and right-wing people who are essentially, they are against lockdowns, against vaccinations, and so on, completely not caring about what happens to ordinary people. And the people who really needed the left, the women, the non-white workers, the other marginalized workers in every country, etc. None of them got the support they needed. And the deaths and the illnesses and the long COVID has been in disproportionately visited on these constituencies, and there is as yet no one to speak for them. So this is the reality that we are living under. So in the case of the pandemic, we really didn't have a proper left opposition to what was going on, which would have been, based on science, but it was not there.
Thank you very much. Finally, I would like you to reflect on your third concept, the war. My question will be about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And of course, all wars, all events, all developments could be contextualized in the broader context of geopolitical economy. There's no question about that. But sometimes the decisions of actors are important. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine was not a necessity. The Russians had alternatives, but the Putin's Russia decided to invade Ukraine, started the war, and starting war would be easy, but ending the war is not that easy. It creates lots of problems, and the Ukrainian people, unfortunately, suffered in different ways during the war. So I think it is very important um, to find solutions to this kind of dangerous wars before they start, because once they start, it is really very difficult to stop it. So, how do you see this problem of war in international system? How to uh, solve the war, or how to could interdependence, economic interdependence in global economy would be strengthened further to prevent such unlawful actions from happening. What is your take on it?
You know, let me begin with the last point, because you raise a number of many points. So I hope I'll get to all of them. But let me begin with the last point. The idea that interdependence leads to some kind of has a specific effect on the countries that are becoming interdependent. This is wrong. Keynes said, Keynes in his writings of the 30s in particular, he starts so many different essays by saying, when I was young, I was taught this. And now as I'm realizing, I think this was wrong. I've realized how wrong this was, and so on. And what Keynes very clearly realized is that interdependence was, in fact, what was called interdependence is imperialism. And if you are imposing imperialism, you are going to get wars, because those people who don't want to accept subordination are going to resist. And that's one kind of war that we have definitely seen, all sorts of colonial wars. So what I'm trying to say is that capitalism and war are intimately connected. You cannot really separate them. If you're looking for a peaceful world, I think we should be building a socialist world. Because capitalism, that's only one kind of war. And of course, there is another kind of war which has had which have been in the forefront of people's minds, which is essentially the wars of inter-imperialist rivalry, which is what ultimately both the First and Second World Wars were. Since that time, I would say that we have been living in a period of we have seen wars continue, and the wars have continued chiefly because of the US's aggressive attitude towards the rest of the world, seeking to contain the Soviet Union, to try and subordinate other parts of the world to itself. And after the demise of the Soviet Union, we have seen unending, unprovoked US aggression around the world. The US is the only country in the world which could not be more secure. Do you think Canada or Mexico are going to attack the United States? Of course they're not. But the fact of the matter is that the US, having the most secure borders in the world, spends the most amount of money on wars, threatening the rest of the world. You say that the war against the Russia's actions were unprovoked. The fact of the matter is that there has been ceaseless provocation of Russia with the expansion of NATO, and up to and including the intensification of the attacks on the eastern part of Ukraine, where the civil war had been going on for 8 years. In fact, I remember I was invited by my Russian friend Russian friend Boris Kagarlitsky, who held a conference in Crimea at the time in 2014, soon after Crimea became part of the Soviet Union, and where we met a lot of people from the Donbass region. This was just after the Odessa massacre had taken place, and these were grassroots activists that we met, and they all hoped that Putin would intervene directly and essentially take them over as well, because they needed liberation, or somehow intervene directly to protect them. Putin did not do that. In a certain sense, you could say for these people, Putin did not act fast enough. He waited for 8 years to act on this. So, and during those 8 years, of course, we know that, as some people have pointed out, Ukraine may not be in NATO, but NATO is in Ukraine. Ukraine is essentially being used as a proxy for the West, but particularly for the United States. I think the Germans and the and the French are in this war much less certainly than you might imagine, and they were the ones who brokered the Minsk Accords to try and prevent this from happening. But of course, the United States was in there all the time, encouraging Ukrainian governments not to comply with the Minsk agreements and eventually and intensify the civil war against the eastern side and so on. So there are all of these different elements that are part of the scenario. So I would say that in order to understand war in our present era, we have to understand, number one, capitalism, and number two, in particular, the US desire to the US's actions as the self-appointed head of the capitalist countries, whose purpose is to preserve the preserve capitalism, and that requires the preservation of its imperial power, which is why, by the way, we're not just looking at Ukraine and Russia. What's happening in Ukraine, Russia, etc., is inseparable from what we might witness on the other side of the Eurasian landmass, with China, with Taiwan, and perhaps a few other flashpoints besides. So all of this is taking place, and in my, at least the way I look at it, and I'm happy to discuss it further, but the way I look at it is I'm basically taking the view that this aggression against China and Russia to a lesser extent is really a product of the fact that their rise, or in the Russia's case, its stabilization under Putin, represents a limit to the imperial power of the United States. And I think this is what the US is unwilling to accept. So for me, I think if we want to talk war, then we must talk about capitalism, and in particular about the United States.
Yeah. Thank you. As we are going to finish in 10 minutes or so, we could take one or two questions from the wider audience as time allows. I received one question from the audience. It's about the relevance of your approach for the global climate change and such global common issues. How do you see this fight against climate change? Because it's a common problem, and our audience asks to learn more about your views about these global problems facing humanity.
I have to say that to my regret, thanks to the limitations, you always have a word limit. So I don't discuss this problem a great deal in any of my books, but I do have very strong views about it, not least because in 2020, I served as the platform chair of the only candidate, I think, in Canada to run for the Green Party leadership here in that year on an eco-socialist platform. And so I essentially oversaw the writing of the platform, and I'm very concerned about the whole issue. As you all know, this has been the hottest year so far on record. So that's, and we have had such heat waves and so on for the last many years. So here's what, roughly speaking, I think about it. Number one, I think we are in the context of a complex ecological emergency in which I think there are at least three major elements. Obviously, there is climate change. Secondly, there is the loss of biodiversity. And thirdly, which is very serious, there are parts of the world where there are not enough bees to pollinate crops, and this is a huge problem. And thirdly, there is pollution. So all of these are enormous problems. I don't want to, and I also think that in many ways they are internal to capitalism. There is a general tendency to imply that somehow, China is the big problem and third world countries are the big problem because they want to have the same lifestyles as first world countries do. I mean, these are just, first of all, these countries are not going to, their development is going to have to look very different from the development of first world countries with its enormous resource. The first world countries have used resources in the most profligate fashion. They are going to have to be much more careful about it, but nevertheless, they will develop. The question is how. And so to my mind, the important thing to remember is that growth itself is not the issue. You can have growth of a sort that is not resource intensive, that does not contribute to climate change, etc. By growth, we mean all sorts of forms of production, including the production of services, which enhance human well being. Okay, and not all of them are necessarily have to have the same resource footprint. What do I mean by that? Consider the following. The golden age, if you look at a graph of world growth, the world grew much faster during the golden age than afterwards, that in the neoliberal era. But it is in the neoliberal era that every graph showing, rise of temperature, rise of biodiversity loss, pollution, etc., every such indicator takes a steep rise after 1980, which then tells you that it's not about growth, it's about the kind of growth you have. So I feel that we have an enormous problem. I feel that we are definitely tottering at the brink, but at the same time, given that the world is still dominated by countries with governments committed to preserving corporate power, we are not going to see any serious response to these problems. The way I read the record of what the United States has done, essentially the US in particular will not agree to anything unless it can be a source of profit for its corporations. Any climate mitigation measure, any pollution related measure, etc., they're not going to agree to any measure on ecological issues unless it can be made profitable for their big corporations. And given this, I don't have much hope that the United States and more generally the West is going to do very much. I think there has to be an initiative that comes from elsewhere, not from these governments.
Thank you. One question again from the audience is about the alternatives to capitalism. How do you see alternatives to these problems? Do you see any solution? Do you have any prospects for better future, or this is a cynical world and creating problems? How do you see the future of the world?
Well, I think that so I end my book by simply inserting in the conclusion. The conclusion ends with just the demands that were raised in our manifesto of the International Manifesto Group, which I feel we put in a lot of effort in formulating these demands, and I think that I hope all of you will take a look both at those demands at the end of the book, but also take a look at our manifesto, which is at www.internationalmanifesto.org. What I feel we have to understand is that socialism is not going to arrive in one loud thunderclap. And it's not going to arrive in all countries at the same time. I think each country is going to have to take its own way towards that. And I feel that as the contradictions of capitalism mount, as it will be shown to increasingly be unable to fulfill the most basic human needs. I mean, Professor Tanrısever, you mentioned how our healthcare needs are far from fulfilled at the moment. As we realize this, I think people have to create the understandings and the movements which are capable of taking power, the parties that are capable of taking power, and are willing to say, okay, if the private sector cannot do this, we are going to take public initiatives to build the healthcare systems, the education systems, the production systems, if necessary, which will produce what we need by the methods we need them to be produced by, because we cannot just copy the old methods of the past, which are too resource intensive, etc. So essentially, the initiative has to be gradually taken away from big capital, private capital. I've said big capital in particular because my vision of socialism, particularly for a long time, will have a lot of room for small capital. I think we will, so long as they are regulated, so long as there is an overall structure of regulation that ensures that the activity of small capital coincides with the public need and with the public good and the public interest, there is nothing wrong. But we will go through a long period of what we may call mixed economies. But so long as the initiative is in the hands, the political power is in the hands of agencies, political parties that are committed to the public good, I think we will be each country will tread its own path towards socialism in its own way, depending on its history, its economy, its needs, and so on.
Yeah, thank you so much for your enlightening talk and also answers to questions. Unfortunately, there were a few other questions from the audience, but we should end in 3 minutes. I would like to thank Professor Desai again, and I would like to also invite the audience to read her open access book from Routledge because you could formulate your ideas better by reading the book. Of course, there would be certain ideas you may agree and certain ideas you may not agree, but this calls for discussion. Important thing is to have questions, not answers, because answers could change, but questions deserve attention, and it will attract further debate, academic debate, and we will learn more from these issues that shape mankind in different ways. So human beings are in search for answers for their questions, but sometimes um, we need new approaches for understanding old problems, and sometimes we need also old approaches for recognizing new challenges. So there are new developments, new challenges, but also new questions. It is important to be open-minded and to pay attention to global challenges that affect mankind as a whole. So I would like to give the floor to Professor Desai for her final remarks. But before that, I would like to thank Cappadocia University Rector Professor Hasan Ali Karasar and Professor Şafak Oğuz from Cappadocia University. They were quite helpful in organizing this event, and their conference series is really quite interesting. I'm very thankful to the organizers and also Professor Desai. With this, I stop here and give the floor to Professor Desai for her final remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Tanrısever, and also to Şafak Oğuz for inviting me, for moderating here. And I would just perhaps like to close by saying that, I guess one of the implications of what we talked about today and the discussion we had is that socialism will really be what we make it. It will arise in response. It will arise as a result of how in each country we respond to the problems that we face. Because one thing is very clear: capitalism is now at this point capable of producing only more inequality, more injustice, and it's not even capable of producing in the way that some of us thought it was able to. So in that context, I think we were all going to have to roll up our sleeves and think about inventive new ways of addressing human need in a democratic way, in a way that addresses larger human and social needs. So I think that's what socialism is all about. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.